Jingle bell rock, jingle bells swing and jingle bells ring, snowing and blowing fun. Now the jingle hop has begun. Jingle bell rock, jingle bell
In 2010, the most modern airliner in the world, the Airbus A380, was also meant to be the safest. However, a serious incident over Singapore would put this claim to the test, and at stake would be the lives of 440 passengers and 29 crew.
Singapore clearance, good morning. Qantas 32 Super for Sydney, Bay Charlie 23, 469 passengers on board, ready for start and push.
Good morning, Qantas 32. Cleared for pushback and start. Face north for runway 20 center.
Qantas 32 is an Airbus A380 bound for Sydney on the 4th of November 2010. The Super Jumbo, registered VH Oscar Quebec Alpha, is carrying 440 passengers and 29 crew, most of whom are Australians returning home. Qantas is Australia's largest airline and is the longest continuously operating airline in the world. It is also one of the safest, having no fatal accidents since the start of the jet age. The aircraft type, an Airbus A380, is just 3 years old in 2010, with this airframe being delivered in September 2008. The A380 is the largest passenger aircraft ever built, capable of carrying 484 passengers. It utilises the power of 4 highly advanced Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engines, each capable of producing 84,000 pounds of thrust.
Done. Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentor and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, we're going to be talking about a flight where things go really wrong really quickly. We're going to be talking about an uncontained engine failure that cascades into hundreds of different system anomalies, and how the knowledge and CRM and airmanship of the flight crew saves the day. We're going to be talking about Qantas Flight 32, so stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, right on right. Cardinal line 31 right. Delta 260, see you later, dude.
This video is brought to you together with Blinkist. Now, I don't know about you, but I love listening to podcasts and audiobooks when I'm driving to work or when I'm working out. And I love listening to non-fictional books. Now, Blinkist have made that really easy for me because they have more than 3,000 non-fictional books in their library. And the real genius with Blinkist is that they take really large works of non-fiction, like hundreds of pages of books, and they condense them down into the most important points, which they call blinks. That means that you can listen to a whole audiobook for maybe 20 minutes, which means that you can listen to 2 books during a workout session, which is absolutely great. Now, a book that I'm listening to now is The History of Almost Everything by Bill Bryson, and it's really good, guys. Those of you who uses this link here below, which is blinkist.com/mentorpilot, will get 1 week absolute for free, so you can check out that I'm not lying to you, and then you'll get 25% off the price if you choose to sign up. So check it out. All right, my friends. So last week I was reviewing the final report of the SmartWings flight 1125, which was ending up flying across Europe after they experienced an engine failure at 36,000 feet. Now that report was littered with very strange decision making and questionable CRM. So I thought today I want to talk about what actually happens in most of the cases out there, which is where really professional, well-trained flight crew actually saves the day when something happens. So Qantas Flight 32 is an excellent example of both how good CRM and how good system management and knowledge is crucial in order to achieve safe flight. Because sometimes your worst nightmares does happen. Sometimes you end up with system failures that you didn't think was even possible. And when that happens, you need all of that knowledge and all of that CRM and utilizing all of the resources around you in order to get to the best possible outcome. So Flight 32 was a scheduled flight running from Changi Airport in Singapore to Sydney. It was flown by an Airbus A380 and it consisted of a quite different flight crew setup. They had 5 pilots in the cockpit, 24 cabin crew members and 440 passengers on board. The reason there were 5 people in the cockpit was that this was a check flight. So the flight crew was being checked, but not only them, the training captain who was doing the check was also being checked. So you had a check captain and a senior check captain on board. This happens sometimes. When we check out new training captains, it has to be done by a senior training captain. So from time to time, you end up with these kind of flight crew setups. So in the 737-800, for example, I have actually flown with 4 people in the cockpit, which is very crammed for 737. Less so in the case of an Airbus 380. But the thing that you need to understand when it comes to CRM, when you have a situation like this, is that there's going to be a lot of nerves on the flight deck. Right? People are going to be nervous because they're on the check. And also there's going to be questions about what is the actual chain of command when you have 3 captains on board. Now this is where Captain Richard de Crispigny is showing the first sign of what kind of a leader he is. Because already in the bus in towards the airport, and also before they departed, he had a discussion with the other flight crew members about exactly this, saying that this is the chain of command, I am the pilot in command, and then you have your first officer, the second officer, and the check pilots are just sitting there to observe. The only reason they will be interfering is in case of a breach of safety, which is how it works when we do line checks, generally speaking. But it was very, very important that he made this clear, because not only does that relax the cockpit atmosphere, it also shows exactly who does what in case of failure. And that's going to become really important very soon. So the Airbus A380 was now fully fueled to fly to Sydney. They had a normal takeoff and they climbed out, took up the landing gear, took up the flaps. And at about 7,400 feet, the flight crew heard 2 bangs very close to each other. The aircraft started to yaw, indicating a problem with one of the engines, and the first ECAM message appeared. Now ECAM stands for the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System. Full disclosure here, guys, I am not rated on the Airbus, so you'll have to bear with me. But if you think of the ECAM messages as the kind of master caution system that we have on the Boeing, where ECAM, instead of what we get, which is just a general fault message, ECAM actually says what is wrong and what the flight crew should be doing. So the actual action items as well. The ECAM message indicated an engine overheat on engine number 2. That's on the left-hand side of the aircraft. And that initiated the first response from the flight crew. So the pilot flying was the captain. He pressed altitude hold, the aircraft leveled off, and he was expecting the auto thrust to start reducing thrust, because that's what it does in order to try to maintain the airspeed. But here's where the indications of multiple failures started becoming obvious, because the auto thrust did not work. So the captain had to take off the thrust manually and continue to fly. Meanwhile, the first officer, who's pilot monitoring, started handling the ECAM checklist. And the ECAM checklist included reducing thrust on the indicated engine and then wait for 30 seconds to see what happened. Okay? During those 30 seconds, the first officer also made a pan-pan call, which is an urgency call to air traffic control to let them know that they need potential priority and to explain to air traffic control why the aircraft is not following the standard instrument departure. Right. When this was done, the ECAM messages shifted from an engine overheat to an engine fire for a couple of seconds and then back to an overheat, because this is normally how the fire systems work. Okay, there tends to be loops, temperature measuring loops inside of the engines, and the difference between an overheat and a fire is only a temperature difference. So it went briefly into a fire and then back into overheat. This led the flight crew to believe that there was probably a major fault with this engine, and they decided to shut it down. As they shut it down, as expected, they got the engine failure message of engine number 2. However, this was not the only failure message that they got, because unbeknown to the flight crew, what had actually happened was that a faulty oil stub pipe inside of engine number 2 had ruptured, and it had thrown oil into the intermediate pressure turbine, where the oil had ignited and basically shuttered that part of the turbine, which had then wreaked havoc inside of the engine. It had broken through the engine, so it's now an uncontained engine failure, and shrapnel had flown in through about 20 different locations in the underside of the wing and in the underside of the fuselage. That shrapnel had ruptured fuel lines, it had ruptured fuel tanks, it actually caused a fire in the fuel tank that went out by itself, but also, crucially, 2 of the electronic main trunks of the Airbus 380. So the Airbus 380 has redundant electrical systems running to different kind of wire bundles throughout the aircraft. And in this case, this shrapnel had managed to damage the 2 main ones. And when you start to have electrical failures and electrical things going wrong, there can be any number of system failures originating from that. And this is what the flight crew started to see. So instead of the only ECAM message for an engine shutdown or an engine failure in this case, they now had a barrage of ECAM messages. And why is this important then? Well, the thing here, guys, that you have to understand is that an aircraft is not smart, okay? An aircraft will just tell you what's wrong with it. Or in the 737-800, you will just get loads of different warning lights and warning bells going off. It doesn't tell you how done. Well, you can learn a lot of things. Kind of wire bundles throughout the aircraft. And in this case, this shrapnel had managed to damage the 2 main ones. And when you start to have electrical failures and electrical things going wrong, there can be any number of system failures originating from that. And this is what the flight crew started to see. So instead of the only ECAM message for an engine shutdown or an engine failure in this case, they now had a barrage of ECAM messages. And why is this important then? Well, the thing here, guys, that you have to understand is that an aircraft is not smart, okay? An aircraft will just tell you what's wrong with it. Or in the 737-800, you will just get loads of different warning lights and warning bells going off. It doesn't tell you how to interpret a multiple failure scenario. Okay? All of the checklists, if you look at the 737 for example, is built on the assumption that the failure checklist that you're reading is the only failure present, not that you have multiple failures that can affect the same system. And why is this? Well, if you think about it, it's kind of obvious. Like, you cannot build checklists for every conceivable scenario. You cannot have checklists that intertwine with each other. So this means, same for the Airbus, that you need to run through each single ECAM checklist, and then you need to use your system knowledge, your situational awareness to build yourself a picture of what's wrong with your aircraft. And this is exactly what this flight crew was doing. Not only now was he working together with his first officer and his second officer, he was also using the help of the senior check captain and the check captain. So utilizing all available resources. All right? If you've seen my video about PIOSI, you will now start to realize what these guys are doing. They're trying to find out what the problem is. They're then utilizing information from their ECAM, from cabin crew, from pilots who are jump seating, which we'll get to in a second. And then, as they are gathering the information, they start selecting what different options they have. So, how are they going to, deal with the failures themselves? How are they going to fly the aircraft? And how are they ultimately going to land? They select option, they execute, and continuously evaluate. So they're following the PIOSI model here to the letter. All right? Anyway, so just to give you an idea of the kind of failures that they were facing, the ECAM messages that were getting included, the green hydraulic system, low fluid and low pressure. So green hydraulic system on the Airbus is one of the main hydraulic systems. The yellow hydraulic system had engine number 4 pump error. There was a failure of the electrical AC bus number 1 and 2. That was the indications that the main electrical trunks had been partially severed. Flight control in alternate low. Wing slats inoperative, so the leading edge devices did not work. Reduced spoiler and aileron control, so less possibility to actually handle the aircraft in roll. Landing gear control and indicator warning, so unsure if the aircraft is going to be able to lower its landing gear normally or not. Multiple brake failures, including anti-skid system on some of the landing gear pairs, and that's going to be important when it comes to checking the landing distance later on. Multiple fuel system errors, including, crucially, the ability to dump fuel. So the electrical problems that they were getting stopped them from dumping fuel, and of course this was just after departure. They were now carrying a lot of extra fuel, which put the aircraft well above its maximum landing weight. Center of gravity messages, there was fuel imbalances started to build up, both because of the engine failure now, but also because of problems with moving the fuel from different tanks in order to keep the center of gravity where it was supposed to be. Auto throttle and auto land was inoperative. Anti-ice systems were not working. Left wing pneumatic bleed leak. Systems were not working. Left wing pneumatic bleed leak. That means that hot air from the pneumatic bleed, also because of problems with moving the fuel from different tanks in order to keep the center of gravity where it was supposed to be. Auto throttle and auto land was inoperative. Anti-ice systems were not working. Left wing pneumatic bleed leak. That means that hot air from the pneumatic bleeds is leaking into the left wing, which could cause a fire. And then avionic system overheat. And when you have an avionic system overheat, depending on how long that gets, you might start losing crucial instruments. So this is a barrage of things going wrong. Now, here Captain Richard does something that is really indicative of what kind of a leader he was. So when faced with all of these tens or even hundreds of different failures, instead of just focusing on what was not working, he actually started running through the systems that were working. So, okay, so what do we have? What can we do? How is the aircraft actually working? How does it respond to control inputs? How does the engines respond, and so on? And this is a crucial way when you're faced with a multiple failure scenario, to try to just increase your situational awareness, understanding what do you have to work with and what can you do. And this goes through his and the rest of the flight crew's handling of this entire crisis. It's a cool focus on the mission to be done, the objective, what they're trying to achieve, and what kind of tools they have at their avail. So, as they were now dealing with this failure, air traffic control wanted them to go out to an established holding pattern. The flight crew looked at it and asked if they could go to a holding pattern that was specially designed for them, that was closer to the airport, about 30 nautical miles from the airport. And the reason they're doing this is most likely that Richard, the captain, and the rest of the flight crew was thinking, what if this turned into a real catastrophic scenario? How quickly can we get this aircraft down on the ground? And instead of being further away, they wanted to be closer to the airport. About 30 nautical miles is almost gliding distance into the airport. While they were dealing with the different ECAM checklists and they were now flying towards this holding pattern, they sent a second officer out into the cabin. Now, the cabin crew had tried to get a hold of them. They'd used the emergency code to try to get in contact with the flight crew. Unfortunately, that has been lost with all of the ECAM ding messages that had been going on non-stop. So the flight crew hadn't heard the cabin crew, but now they were able to communicate them and instruct them on what was going on. As the second officer came out into the cabin, he was flagged down by what looked like a passenger, but it turned out to actually be an off-duty pilot that was sitting in one of the passenger rows. And that pilot showed him on the in-flight entertainment system, there's a camera in the back of the Airbus A380 showing an overview of the aircraft. And on that camera, you could clearly see that there was liquid that was kind of running down the left wing. So that further indicated the kind of damage that the aircraft had. The second officer then went down to the lower part of the aircraft, looked out on the wing, and could clearly see that there were damage to the left-hand wing as well as to the engine. So he came back with that information into the cockpit. They conferred with each other. And during this time, both the captain and the senior check captain made numerous PAs telling the passengers what was going on, that they had technical difficulties, and also communicated with the cabin crew to let them know what was happening. So you have continuous communication, keeping everyone in the loop here, which is lowering the anxiety level. Even though people are hearing that they have technical problems, most of them could actually see that out through the window anyway. So it's much better to hear that, yes, the flight crew is aware of what's going on and they're dealing with it, than not getting any information at all and having rumors spreading. Because when you have 440 passengers, there's bound to be panic breaking out unless this is handled in a good and efficient way. So it took the flight crew a little over 50 minutes to run through all of the hundreds of ECAM actions that they had to do. And while they were doing this, the second officer, together with the senior check captain, was trying to calculate the required landing distance. Because remember, they could not dump fuel. This meant that they were over 50 tons overweight. Okay? And just to get that into perspective, a 737 empty weight is about 42, 43 tons. So they were carrying more than a 737 over their maximum landing weight. Together with the failures they had with not working slats, with problems with the brake systems, all of that, when they put that into the computer, basically the computer couldn't come up with a figure. But as they tweaked it a little bit and they took away the possibility of a wet runway because it was a nice day and it was dry, they managed to come up with a figure that indicated that they would be able to stop the aircraft if they landed bang where they were supposed to be, on speed, with about 100 meters to spare. Okay? So this indicated that they were able to land. They now started to prepare for that. And the preparation consisted of doing a number of flight control checks. So they were slowing down the aircraft in the holding, trying out the aircraft. Now you might wonder, why would you do that? And the key here is that you don't want to end up at low speed, on final, close to the ground, finding out that a part of your flight controls are not working. So doing continuous flight control checks like this is yet another indication that this crew was really on top of things. They asked for about a 20 nautical mile final, which is a good 10 miles or almost twice the normal final. Lined the aircraft up, started to configure it with whatever flaps they could get out. They couldn't lower the landing gear with the normal system. They had to use an alternate extension system in order to get the landing gear out, but eventually the aircraft was lined up for landing. The aircraft flew down. They tried to use the autopilot, but the autopilot kept disengaging a couple of times. So the captain just decided that no, I'm just going to hand fly this, which is probably smart as well, because then you get a little bit better kind of feel for how the aircraft is moving. And as they were decelerating, they continued to do these flight control checks, because an aircraft might be flying great as you are with the flaps retracted and the landing gear retracted, but then if it has sustained damage, as you're extending leading edge device, well in this case they couldn't, but trailing edge devices, for example, if there's damage to them, then all of a sudden you might get a problem with flight controls. And as the speed is decreasing, it's the same thing. So they were continuously checking that, yeah, we have everything under control, as they now descended down towards the landing runway. Meanwhile, the senior Czech captain told the cabin crew to prepare the aircraft for a possible runway overrun and a possible evacuation, so everyone was ready for that. They landed the aircraft perfectly what it was supposed to. Initially, the deceleration was really slow, probably had to do with the lack of anti-skid on some of the wheel pairs. But eventually, they managed, with max manual braking, to get the aircraft down to a complete stop, about 150 meters before the end of the runway. At this point, since the air traffic control was well informed, all of the emergency equipment started coming up towards the aircraft, and the pilots started shutting the aircraft down. They shut down all of the engines, or at least they thought they shut down all of the engines, and when they shut down the last one, the aircraft went into kind of a degraded electrical mode. But before it did that, they observed that the brake temperature on the left-hand side was close to 900 degrees Celsius and increasing. So the brakes were extremely hot, which was completely normal if you think about landing with 50 tons overweight. But the problem, of course, was that they had seen that they were leaking fuel. And indeed, the fuel was dripping down very close to these white hot brakes and could at any given second have burst into a fire. Right, they knew this, okay? The first officer asked the captain if he could tell the firefighters to start soaking the area below the brakes with firefighting foam in order to make sure that the fuel was covered with foam and couldn't reach the brakes. The captain thought that was a great idea, so he relayed the information to the firefighters, which did that, and that probably saved them from fire. But now, of course, comes the dilemma. Should you evacuate the aircraft? Okay, you have 440 people on board, you have red-hot brakes, and on top of this, it turns out that one of the engines, engine number 1, did not shut down. No matter what the flight crew did, the firefighters said that the engine was still running. The flight crew did everything they could. They pulled the fire handle, they shot the 2 fire bottles into the engine. Nothing stopped the engine from running. So probably there was some kind of electrical fault in the communication to the engine. The engine just kept running. So now you have an engine running, you have white hot brakes, you have a fuel leak on the left hand side, and you have passengers on board. Okay, a less cool flight crew might have just initiated an evacuation to try to get everyone out as quickly as possible. But these guys, they sat in and they discussed both with the firefighters and amongst themselves and said, let's try to disembark the passengers on the right hand side using normal steps. And that's what they did. So they attached one set of steps in the front. The passengers started to disembarking, and that was after an hour of trying to shut down the engine and trying to secure the aircraft down after landing. It took a further hour to get all of the passengers off and away from the aircraft. So this whole ordeal took over 2 hours from when they landed until everyone was off the aircraft. Meanwhile, the cabin crew was ready to initiate an evacuation at any given point. The flight crew said that if we see that there's a chance of a fire or the fire is breaking out, then we might initiate the emergency evacuation and, just start evacuating as normal. But they didn't have to. And because they didn't have to, no one was hurt. So this whole incident, with all of these multiple failures and everything from leading edge devices not working, from hydraulic failures, from uncontained engine failures, didn't lead to a single hurt human being. Okay, part of the engine that had exploded fell down onto an island of Batam. It fell down onto a couple of vehicles and onto a school, but no one was seriously hurt. And they managed to eventually stop the running engine by 2 firefighting trucks just pumping it full with firefighting foam and effectively smothering the engine. And that's how they shut it down. So, what can we learn from this then? Well, you can learn a lot of things. First of all, CRM, usage of all available resources. All of the flight crew and the cabin crew and even some people that was deadheading with the aircraft was helping to get as much information as possible to come up with the right decisions to make. Keep yourself cool. Look at what the aircraft can do and not what it cannot do, right? You need to plan for the worst, but you need to handle with what you have, which is what they did. They used a variation of PIOSI, which I've talked about in a previous video, so check out that video if you're more interested. And then, once they had landed and everyone was down and safe, the captain actually went in and talked to all of the passengers, explaining what had happened, how it had happened, and which led this from being a public relations disaster, with social media, everyone is filming, everyone is sending it out on Twitter. Now all of the passengers felt that the flight crew had done a great job, the cabin crew were calm, relaxed, and they knew what they were doing. And this is what was being sent out into the Twitter sphere, all right? They were showering the flight crew and the cabin crew with praise on how it was being dealt with, how they were getting information, how they were being treated, and something that was, by all means, should be a public relations disaster was actually turned into something fairly positive. Now, the final report is available, and I have links to some of the reports down here and some of the articles that I've used to create this video. But all in all, this is a brilliant example of what flight crew and cabin crew is doing every day out there. Because what you don't understand is that small failures does occur, small things happen, and if they're being left unchecked, they can lead into bigger things. But they're not. The reason you don't hear about these things is because trained flight crew and trained cabin crew and engineers out there are handling it the way that they're trained to handle it every single day, so it doesn't become a headline. Okay, and that's what I want you to take away from this. This is what you should and can expect from your crew. Most people who are afraid of flying hate seeing news about aviation accidents and incidents. But now imagine that you're seeing live coverage on an ongoing incident as it's happening, but you are sitting inside of the aircraft it's happening to. That's exactly what happened to the passengers on board JetBlue Flight 292, and I will tell you the entire story, so stay tuned.
A huge thank you to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. The story about Jet2 Flight 292 started on the 21st of September 2005, and the aircraft involved was a 3-year-old Airbus A320. The aircraft started its stay in JFK Airport in New York, and before the first flight, the engineers had done some light maintenance work to the nose gear, where they had replaced some proximity sensors. These are basically sensors that feels if the aircraft is in the air or on the ground. Once the maintenance job was complete, the aircraft was flown over from JFK over towards Bob Hope Airport in Burbank on the west coast of the United States. And there it was supposed to do a quick crew change, and the aircraft was then supposed to fly back towards JFK later in the afternoon. For the return flight, there was 140 passengers scheduled, 4 cabin crew members and 2 pilots. Now, the 2 pilots were both very experienced. The captain was a 47-year-old with 10,800 hours and about 2,500 hours on the Airbus A320. He was assisted by a 37-year-old first officer who had around 5,700 hours and just under 1,300 hours on type. The weather in Burbank was beautiful, with only some high clouds, good visibility, light winds, and it was decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for the return flight to New York. So he started setting up the cockpit, started programming the flight management computer, while the captain did the walk around outside. Now, during the walk around, the captain didn't notice anything suspicious, so he got back into the cockpit, and together the crew finished up the pre-flight preparation, the checklist, and started preparing for the pushback. Before they could go, though, they had to complete the fueling, and they had requested quite a lot of fuel, 14,750 kilos for their flight over to New York. But eventually the fueling was completed, the crew received the fuel receipt, and at the time 15:17 local time, the Airbus A320 started pushing back from the gate and started taxiing out for takeoff runway 15 in Burbank. The first officer was pilot flying, initiated the takeoff roll, he set takeoff thrusts, the aircraft started accelerating down the runway, it got airborne, and once it achieved positive rate of climb, the first officer asked the captain to select gear up. Now here is where the problems are starting, because the captain reaches over and, according to his statement, tries to move the landing gear lever up, but it won't move up. Instead, he receives the first ECAM message, which is landing gear shock absorber fault, and then very quickly followed by nose wheel steering fault. Now, what has actually happened here is that 2 lugs on the upper support of the nose wheel shock absorber has completely sheared off, probably on an earlier flight. Now, the function of those 2 lugs is to keep the shock absorber from being able to rotate inside of the nose gear leg. And without those lugs, the nose gear has actually moved slightly out of position after takeoff. This was then felt by the landing gear control and interface unit, the LGICU, which stops the retraction of the landing gear. And the reason it's doing that is because there's just unlimited amount of room inside of the nose wheel well bay. And if the nose wheel is not in the correct position, then it might not have enough room to be retracted properly. So that's the reason for the first warning that was issued. And on top of that, another computer called the Braking and Steering Control Unit, the BSCU, has also noticed that something is off with the nose wheel, and it has deactivated the nose gear steering, and that was the reason for the second ECAM warning. Now, it was later found that it was actually the BSCU that was part of the reason that this problem happened in the first place. Because the BSCU had on previous flights been doing something called a self-test, which has happened anytime that the gear was selected down, the BSCU would start to move the nose wheel left and right a couple of times in order to just check that the nose wheel steering was working properly. The problem was that it was doing this as many as 57 times during the descent in towards the airport. And because on this aircraft the shock absorber had not been properly pressurized, it hadn't been serviced properly, this caused a bit of friction to build up in the upper support. And when the BSCU was doing all of these self-tests, it caused fatigue cracking in those lugs, which eventually broke them off. The pilots, of course, had no idea that this was going on. They only knew that they were facing a potentially very serious problem with their landing gear. So the captain got into contact with SoCal Control. SoCal gave them a clearance to climb to 14,000 feet and then handed them over to Los Angeles Control. Los Angeles Control then gave them vectors in like a box-like holding pattern over the Palmsdale, Lancaster area at 14,000 feet. Now this problem didn't only stop them from retracting the gear, it also stopped them from engaging the autopilot and the autothrottle, which meant that the first officer was now hand-flying the aircraft with gear down at 14,000 feet, and he was also taking care of the radio communication, because as they were now holding, the captain started to get into contact with JetBlue management, both the dispatch and their technical department. JetBlue Maintenance did a remote diagnostic of the aircraft, and that diagnostic showed that there was a possibility that this might be an indicator fault. But together with the flight crew, they decided that the best thing to do is probably to fly over towards Long Beach Airport. In Long Beach, JetBlue has a major maintenance hub, and potentially come in and do a landing there to have a look at it. After they had decided to do this, the captain got into contact with the cabin crew and informed them about what was going on and about their plans to go over towards Long Beach. And it's at this point that the cabin crew informs him that the passengers are actually able to follow their own flight on the in-flight entertainment system, because the aircraft has an uplink that enables the passengers to watch TV. And of course, this has now been going on for a while, and because this is happening over the Los Angeles area, multiple TV stations has picked up that this aircraft is having a problem. So the passengers are actually watching themselves on news in real time, which is not something that I've ever heard of before this, and it's definitely not something that I would like to be part of myself. The aircraft now starts to descend in towards Long Beach, and the pilots have informed air traffic control that if they are able to do a successful landing, they won't be able to taxi off the runway because they're having this problem with the nose wheel steering. During the descent in towards Long Beach, the captain also asked the tower if it would be possible to do a low altitude flyby of the tower so that they can inspect the position of the nose gear prior to their actual landing. This is agreed to by air traffic control, and as the aircraft is entering the approach in towards Long Beach, a local traffic watch helicopter which is nearby is able to see them on approach and can tell them that yes, the nose gear is actually angled 90 degrees towards the direction of the aircraft. The pilots acknowledge this, but they continue the low approach and flyby of the tower anyway. And as they're doing the go-around, the air traffic controllers in the tower can indeed verify that the nose gear seems to be twisted 90 degrees off its axis. The pilots now know that they're facing a much more serious problem than they initially thought. The captain issues a mayday call at this point, and then they request a climb to 6,000 feet to keep troubleshooting the issue. When they level off at 6,000 feet, they know that there are no ECAM actions for this particular problem, and there's no real guidance in their manuals either. However, there is guidance for something called landing with an unsafe landing gear. Now, this is not exactly the same as the pilots are experiencing, because they actually have all of the landing gear extended and they have green indication on their landing gear indicator, basically telling them that the landing gear is safe. But they also know that the nose wheel is 90 degrees towards the axis, and they're not sure that if they land with this problem, the landing gear will be able to take that amount of stress that it will be subjected to. It could potentially collapse, and in that case, they are theoretically in a situation with an unsafe landing gear. So that is how they're approaching this issue. Now, one thing that is playing in the pilot's favor here is the amount of fuel that they have on board. The Airbus A320 is a short to medium haul aircraft, which means that it has a reasonably small difference between the maximum takeoff weight and the maximum landing weight. And because of this, there's not really a need for a fuel dumping mechanism on an Airbus, just like it's not on the aircraft that I fly, the Boeing 737. This means that the only way for this aircraft to reduce its landing weight, and by that also reducing the potential stress on their nose gear, is to burn off fuel. And they have a lot of fuel on board. So this is what they're now starting to do. The aircraft is now once again receiving vectors, and this time they are in the area between Santa Catalina Island and Long Beach Harbor. And once again, the pilots have to discuss together with the company representatives what the best solution to this problem is. And the kind of things that they're talking about is, for example, is there any system reset that we can do that could potentially get the nose gear back into the centered position again? Also, what kind of fuel will give us the best aft center of gravity that will take away as much as possible the stress on the nose gear after landing? What kind of configuration should we be using during the landing, and how is the aircraft going to handle once we lower the nose gear? Are there any other checklists that we should be going through that is not immediately apparent to us? And also, how should we deal with the passengers? should be going through once we lower the nose gear? Are there any other checklists that we should be going through that is not immediately apparent to us? And also, how should we deal with the passengers? How should we brief them and the cabin crew? And what would we do after landing? What will a potential evacuation look like?
Oh, this is an 80-pound wheel of Parmesan cheese. I actually get these pretty often. Today I'm going to show you how to make a quick flaming bowl of cheese wheel pasta. Everybody's dream in life. I'd make this every day, but it's not exactly cheap. Thankfully, I have honey. It's a super easy way to save tons of time and money online. It automatically searches the web for promo codes at tons of places you already shop, so you don't have to. When it finds a working code, you just watch the price drop. And you can get it too when you click here. Thank you, honey. Saving money on the stuff I'm buying normally means I have more money left over for things like this. We'll add in our pasta, then finish with a pesto cream sauce. Don't look at me like that. Oh, I almost forgot, a little extra cheese. Time for a taste. Okay, now I really have to save every penny I can get just to make this again. Honey's gonna help me out there. So go on, try it for yourself.
Now, all of these kind of discussions and the way that this flight crew is discussing amongst themselves shows a fantastic use of threat and error management. Because this is exactly how we're supposed to deal with it. You are faced with some kind of problem, and then you have to kind of project how this problem is going to affect you in the future. That is the management part of threat and error management, and this is exactly what they're doing. This is actually a very good example of how time available decision making is supposed to look. Another thing that the pilot needs to decide at this point is where they are going to divert to. Initially, they were looking at Edwards Air Force Base, Miramar, but the captain decided that he would actually prefer to go to Los Angeles International Airport. And the reason for that is because the runway is slightly longer and they have a very wide runway as well. And he thought that if we are going to have problems with the directional control of the landing, it is better to have a wider runway, once again showing good situational awareness. In the back of the aircraft, the cabin crew has been briefed by the pilots about the problem they're facing. They have also been told to move passengers and hand luggage from the front of the aircraft towards the back in order to try to move the center of gravity a little bit more backward to once again get pressure off the nose wheel. They're also handing out blankets, pillows, they're explaining what's going on to the passengers, they're serving them with non-alcoholic drinks, and they're starting to prepare them for an emergency landing. And I have to say that the description of this in the final report shows excellent competency from the cabin crew. They're doing the job exactly the way that they're supposed to do. Really, really nice to see. Unfortunately, the passengers were still able to watch themselves on the news on their in-flight entertainment screens at this point. And one of those passengers, screenwriter Zach Dean, actually started to really contemplate his own mortality in this situation. And that eventually led up to him writing a script that became the movie Deadfall. Now, the cabin crew did eventually switch off the in-flight entertainment screens about 50 minutes prior to the approach into Los Angeles Airport. And what happened during that approach and the subsequent landing, I'm going to tell you all about after this short message. Check it out now. Before they start the approach, the captain once again calls up the cabin crew and he informs them that there is a possibility that after landing the nose gear might collapse. And if it does so, there's going to be an evacuation needed. But of course, with the nose gear collapsed, the aircraft is going to be at a very strange angle, with the nose very low and the back of the aircraft very high. So he tells them to not use the aft emergency exits if this happens, because it's a chance that the exit slides are not going to be long enough to actually even touch the ground below them. Once again, this shows exceptional threat and error management and situational awareness on behalf of the flight crew. As the aircraft leaves 6,000 feet and start descending down towards Los Angeles Airport, millions of people are watching this happening live. This means that there is a big possibility that the relatives and the friends of the people on board are also watching this. The cabin crew knows this and they kind of step up away from the procedures for a short second, where they let all of the people on board take up their mobile phones and call their friends and families for a couple of minutes before they tell them to once again switch it off for landing. And I think that this just shows great compassion and understanding on behalf of the cabin crew. On the ground, the rescue personnel at Los Angeles Airport has had plenty of time to prepare for the arrival of the aircraft. They have gathered all of the emergency equipment that might be needed close to runway 25 left, where the aircraft is going to eventually land, but they didn't spray any fire retardant foam on the runway. And the reason for this, I've actually talked a little bit about in a previous video that you can check out, but the short version is that it has been proven that foaming up a runway prior to an emergency landing actually doesn't really help. It's very hard to judge where exactly an aircraft is going to touch down, and even if you do, it's not going to have much of an effect. And probably the most important reason that we don't do it is because you are using up valuable fire retardant foam that you might have to use if the worst thing would happen and the aircraft would actually catch fire. So it would be very rare for you to ever see the fire department foaming up a runway prior to an emergency arrival almost anywhere in the world nowadays. Now, the weather at Los Angeles Airport as this aircraft is now initiating its approach is absolutely beautiful. The surface wind is 240 degrees at 13 knots, that's almost straight down runway 25 left, and only some few clouds and a temperature of 21 degrees Celsius. After almost 3 hours airborne and with the fuel reduced down to 4,500 kilos, which had been shown to be the optimum fuel load inside of the Airbus A320 to get the center of gravity as aft as possible, the captain, who is now taken over the role as pilot flying, initiates the approach. The reason that the captain had chosen runway 25 left is pretty simple. It's the longest runway around. It's 3,328 meters long. And the crew will need all of that runway because they're now following the procedure called landing with an unsafe landing gear. That procedure indicates to the captain that they need to do a couple of things. But after landing, they're not supposed to use neither the thrust reversers, not the spoilers, or the outer brake of the aircraft. So why wouldn't they be able to do that? Well, the idea is that if you're landing with the nose gear unsafe, there is a possibility that the nose gear might collapse. And if it does so, you don't really want the engines to be running when it does, because there might be parts from the nose gear, apart from the nose, that might be sucked into the engines, and the engines could then potentially catch fire.
Wendy's fries are always hot and crispy.
Friday!
So Toby says every day is now
Friday, Friday, Friday. Tuesday.
Friday.
Wednesday.
Friday.
Friday.
Friday. I always remember that
Not
one.
because that's the easy one.
Try Wendy's hot and crispy fries, preferred almost 2-to-1 over McDonald's.
Enlisted is the free brand new online World War II shooter. Command a squad of soldiers and participate in legendary battles of the...
So the idea is that after landing, you're supposed to shut the engines down. Once you have achieved a safe landing, one of the pilots, the pilot monitoring, is going to shut the engines down. And of course, if you shut the engines down, the thrust reversers are not going to make any difference anyway. But even if you are using the thrust reversers, they are actually causing more forward pressure onto the nose wheel. When it comes to the spoilers, there's probably another reason for this, and that is if you're using the spoilers and the nose gear collapses, there's a possibility that the body of the aircraft might become slightly skewed, twisted. And what you don't want to do is put yourself in a position where you've managed to get the spoilers up on the wings, but because of this skew in the body, they're now not possible to retract, and that will make it harder for the passengers who are evacuating onto the wings to actually do so. And finally, the reason that you don't want to use the outer brake system is very similar. When you start braking, that's also going to put more pressure onto the nose wheel. And here, if you have a very long runway, you can just utilize the aerodynamic braking of the aircraft and the friction braking from the wheels and not use so much braking, thus using less pressure on the nose wheel and potentially keep it from collapsing at all. So this is what the pilots are thinking about as they're now flying the ILS approach into runway 25 left. As the aircraft descends to 1,000 feet, the first officer depressurizes the cabin. This he does in order to make sure that there's no residual pressure inside of the cabin in case they have to immediately evacuate after the aircraft comes to a stop. When they pass 500 feet, he takes up the PA mic and he calls the cabin saying, "Brace, brace, brace." Now the cabin crew has gone through the cabin and instructed all of the passengers on how to do the brace position perfectly. So the passengers will now hold the brace position until the aircraft comes to a full stop. At time 18:20 local time, the Airbus A320 touches down at a speed of about 115 knots, well within the touchdown zone on runway 25 left. 5 seconds after the touchdown, the first officer reaches over and depresses both of the fire switches, which causes the engines to shut down. The captain holds the nose of the aircraft up to keep the nose wheel away from the ground as long as possible, but he also knows that he can't do it for so long that the aerodynamic effectiveness of the elevators stop working. So eventually he lowers the nose gear down. Almost immediately, the two nose gear tires are deflated and ripped apart. The nose gear wheels are then grinded towards the asphalt down all the way to the wheel axle, and they're creating a lot of sparks and smokes that we could all see on these famous TV pictures as they were doing so. The aircraft eventually comes to a complete stop, bang on the center line of runway 25 left, and initially the crew are waiting because they don't really know whether or not the nose gear is going to collapse. But eventually it becomes clear that the nose gear is holding up, and instead of initiating an evacuation, they call for some external steps to be moved up towards the front left exit, and they start disembarking the passengers through that door. Now, this is something that the crew had also pre-briefed prior to the landing, because you don't really want to evacuate an aircraft unless you absolutely have to. And the reason for that is that during an evacuation, you can be almost sure that some of the passengers are going to hurt themselves. They're going to strain their wrist or maybe break an ankle or something like this. So an evacuation is something that we do as a very last resort. In this incident, none of the passengers or crew were hurt, and the aircraft only sustained some very minor damage to the nose gear, as I explained before. Actually, they replaced part of the nose gear as it was standing there on the runway, and the aircraft was then towed into a hangar where they started to investigate what the reason was for this situation to appear. And that's where they noticed through a boroscopic inspection of the nose gear that the lugs had been ripped off, the upper support of the shock absorber, like I explained earlier. And this led to Airbus changing some of the software in the BSCU, the brake and steering control unit, so that it wouldn't do as many of those pre-landing tests as it had been doing before. They also noticed the incorrect pressure inside of the shock absorber, and they started looking into why that was. That's when they noticed that when the shock absorber was being serviced, it was being done so with the entire weight of the aircraft still resting on it. And it turned out that it was almost impossible to get the right pressure in when that was the case. As a consequence of this, it was mandated that whenever the nose gear shock absorber had to be serviced, it has to be done so with the nose gear properly jacked up so that there were no weight resting on it. Now, it would turn out that this was not going to be the last time that an Airbus A320 landed with the nose gear set 90 degrees perpendicular to the aircraft. There was going to be many, many more of them, but interestingly, for many different reasons. And if you want to know more about that, I've actually done a Mentor Now video on my new channel that I hope that you have subscribed. A lot of the training
If you Walmart, you know that with everyday low prices, you can spend a little less to get a little more, to make life a little better.
What's up, guys? I'm a little bit short on time today because it's just basketball season, and between practice every day and games, it's hard to maintain a daily uploading schedule, which is what I'm really trying to do. I'm trying to upload every day. So I thought I'd just keep it simple since I honestly don't have time today, and I just re-upload my first video. Let me know what you think. I don't know, just watch it. I did react to it, but when I was reacting to it, I was talking so much you couldn't hear the video, and it almost made the video not funny. So I'm not going to react to it. I'm just going to upload the video and let me know what you think.
Alright. Gee, where am I? What just happened? What did you say? From Saul, before you can advance, you must flip every switch and kill all the monsters that come out. If you try to open the door without killing them, you will explode. Okay? Here's your weapon. Ooh, a diamond sword. It's not smart, Saul. Now nothing can kill me. Ooh, start over here. Zombies, that's easy. Bet I could kill these quick. Too bad it isn't daytime. They're just burn. I'm not afraid of Saul's little traps. Can't hurt me. Some of the zombies aren't even touching me. They're so confused. Come here, zombie. That's right, you better die. Hurt me. They're just that I can kill me. Ooh, start over here. Zombies, that's easy. Bet I could kill these quick. Too bad it isn't daytime. They're just burn. I'm not afraid of Saul's little traps. Can't hurt me. Some of the zombies aren't even touching me. They're so confused. Come here, zombie. That's right, you better die. You all better die. Just keep dying. Uh-huh. Ooh. Oh, no. I want to go. Zombie pigmen. Ooh. This may be a challenge. You know how hard zombie pigmen are. Them swords of theirs, they'll really hurt you. Ooh. Yes. Back off. Get away. That's what I thought. Not my own friends. No. I can't do it. I can't kill them. Not Caleb. Not Toller. Oh, well, he's not really my best friend. Dylan. I could care less.
GTA Myth Test.
CarMax is reimagining car buying for you.
Ah, Disney. What could be more wholesome? Always making sure we're fed with lots of morally uplifting content, and all for the small price of total power and control over our minds from more or less birth. But hey, Aladdin, that was a classic, right? And don't even get me started on Frozen. But is everything at Disney as clean-cut and full of smiles as it appears from the outside? Well, surprisingly, the answer is no. From the secret ride left to rot to the screams that are totally fake, here's 20 secrets Disney does not want you to know about. Number 20. River Country and its mysterious closure. Would you believe that the Walt Disney Company let a full theme park rot away in the middle of Walt Disney World for almost 20 years? We wouldn't blame you for being skeptical, since the story sounds nothing like what Disney usually does, but it's true. This is the story of how that park, River Country, was built, why it had to close, and what'll happen to the land in the future. On June 20th, 1976, River Country opened near Fort Wilderness Resort and Campground. The park was one of Walt Disney World's first big additions after it opened in 1971. It was also one of the first fully themed water parks ever built. But in 2001, River County shut down for its annual winter repairs and just never opened again. Disney closed its water park. The reason why is creepy. At first, Disney didn't say anything about the situation. In 2005, Disney finally said that River Country was closed for good, but no further explanation was given. Many ideas have been circulated online about why River Country closed. One of the most popular ideas is that the park had to close because there was a brain-eating amoeba in the water. Okay, that does sound pretty bad. Also, during the 1980s, there were 2 drowning deaths at the park. However, these deaths had nothing to do with why the park closed. In reality, the biggest reason River Country had to close was that it just couldn't keep up with demand next to its much bigger water park siblings, especially after 9/11, when a lot of people just stopped traveling. Before we go on, like this video, smash that subscribe button, and click the notification bell right now, or this centipede will crawl on your face when you're sleeping. Number 19. The screams that you heard on the Tower of Terror were recorded. The Twilight Zone Tower of Terror was one of Disneyland's 3 biggest scary rides, the others being the Haunted Mansion and the Pirates of the Caribbean. It was in Disneyland's Hollywood Studios and combines the spooky mystery of the classic TV show The Twilight Zone with the terrifying feeling of falling down an elevator shaft 13 stories over and over again. The Tower of Terror has a lot of mystery and wonder, just like the TV show that it was based on. And I've been on it, it's actually pretty scary. When you stand on Sunset Boulevard and look up at the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, you probably hear your fair share of screams, but you can't believe every scream that you hear. Because Disney plays a recording of screams in the Hollywood Tower Hotel to make it more scary. You might hear real guests screaming for their lives. It is a scary ride, but if you pay close attention, you might hear that the rest just play on a loop. A legend about the attraction says that the Hollywood Tower Hotel, which is the real name of the building, was hit by lightning on October 31st of 1939. When lightning hit, 5 people who were in the elevator of a hotel went missing. In a spooky way, the building really was hit by lightning while it was being built, just like the story. As far as I know, it didn't cause anyone to go missing, though. As a safety measure, lightning rods are up on the top of the building now. Number 18. The bathrooms in Liberty Tree Tavern and Columbia Harbor House are so far back, they're technically in other lands, keeping the no bathroom theme in Liberty Square. Liberty Square is set in colonial times, and Disney did everything it took to make it look just like that. This part of the Magic Kingdom, for example, is the only one without public facilities, because back in the day, you just pooped in a pot and threw it out the window. In this land's era, there would have been no public toilets because there was no indoor plumbing. So people who visit Liberty Square will have to go somewhere nearby like Frontierland or Fantasyland if they really want to use the bathroom. But even though there are no public bathrooms, the restaurants in Liberty Square do have them. So if you eat in this area, you won't have to worry about throwing your poop out a pot somewhere. Every little detail at Disney Park has a meaning. There's a big tree on the property called the Liberty Tree. 13 lanterns hang from its branches. During the Revolutionary War, each lamp stood for one of the original 13 colonies that made up the United States. This little detail is a good example of how Disney uses every part of its park to tell a story. Number 17. Joffrey's Donuts are actually from a local shop called Donut King. Have you ever found yourself drooling over the donuts at a Joffrey's coffee and tea kiosk or the one in Disney Springs? We don't blame you, but we do have a secret that even most locals don't know, and it's very important information if you love donuts. If you didn't know, Joffrey's is the Walt Disney World Resort's official coffee company, and the pastries at many Joffrey's kiosks around the resort are better than anything you'll find elsewhere. Joffrey's even sells huge pastries, like mind-blowingly huge, humongous pastries. They're so big that I saw a family of 4 share one apple fritter, and everyone looked ready to burst. They've become so much a part of Disney culture that now they have their own cult following. But the famous Disney desserts that bring people culture, that now they have their own cult following. But the famous Disney desserts that bring people to the parks aren't made by Disney at all. Donut King is the local bakery that makes these donuts. If you look closely, you might even see boxes from Donut King near Joffrey's when the places get new food. In Mineola, Winter Park, and Leesburg, you can find Donut King locations. So yes, you can get Joffrey's donuts without having to go to Disney World. Number 16. Pirates of the Caribbean might be haunted by a mischievous ghost named George. Walt Disney World is a place where dreams come true, and you can get away from the stress and bad things going on in the real world. But Disney also has a darker side, and you can decide if you want to believe some of the ghost stories that have been told about it, especially the one about George the Ghost from the Pirates of the Caribbean. People say that if you don't give George a good morning in the morning, the Pirates of the Caribbean ride will have problems all day, like breakdowns and other weird technical glitches. And if no one tells George good night, the attraction has been known to stay on all night, with some parts still running in the next morning. People have said before that guests who complain about the attraction, make fun of it, or wish that it would end sooner often have a breakdown while riding it. George is said to hang out in one place more than others, and that it's in the big room with the burning city in the back. People say that when they're near Pirate Pig and almost under the drunk
Get this extremely high-tech $3,000 drone for a fraction of the price. This 15-year-old boy who lives in the
pirate with the hairy leg, they can often feel his presence or a ghostly chill. So I guess just, say hi to George when you're there if you know it's good for you. Number 15. The Two Brothers in American Adventure are based on two Imagineers. Some of the most impressive robotic shows at Epcot can be seen at the American Adventure in the American Adventure Pavilion. You must have felt your jaw drop when you saw the Ben Franklin robot walk up the stairs. You might not know this, but the two brothers in the song Two Brothers are based on John Olson and Jeff Burke, two Imagineers, and these are the guys who made it all come to life. The Epcot Center at Walt Disney World opened on October 1st of 1982.
Dysentery, and there be not a ration amongst us.
Walt Disney had a dream for Epcot, which stands for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. It was one of his last big goals. It was supposed to be a real city where people would live, work, and play. But after Walt Disney died, the company he started decided not to build the city. Sadly, without Walt's creative vision, the company's leaders thought the project was just too risky. Many of the ideas and principles of Epcot did, however, influence the design and layout of Walt Disney World, especially when it came to the transportation system and the creation of Reedy Creek Improvement District and Lake Buena Vista, which are both controlled by the Walt Disney Company. Number 14. The hyenas and African dogs take turns on Kilimanjaro safaris. Kilimanjaro Safaris is an open-air safari through 110 acres that looks like an African reserve, and it's home to 34 species of wildlife. Guests get to see African wildlife roaming free in forests, grasslands, and savannas while they're on board. When the ride first opened, poachers were a big part of the story, and it was a bit scary. There was also a scary moment when a rickety bridge looked like it was about to fall apart as they crossed it. Both of these parts of the story were taken out to suit modern audiences' much milder tastes. In 2016, Animal Kingdom started sunset safaris, which let people ride Kilimanjaro safaris even when it was getting dark. Most people who ride the Kilimanjaro safaris at Disney's Animal Kingdom are happy to see the African dogs in the savannah. But did you know that hyenas live here too? Every day in the late afternoon, hyenas switch places with African dogs, but only if they want to. So if you ride Kilimanjaro safaris at the end of the day, you might see a hyena. Number 13. The different colors of pavement on Main Street are there for a reason. When you walk down Main Street, USA in the Magic Kingdom, you probably have your eyes looking up at Cinderella Castle or the amazing theming, the different shops, characters, and performers, or the Dapper Dans and the Main Street Philharmonic. But next time, look down instead of just up. You'll see that there's different colors of pavement. Some people have said that part of the reason for this is to help guests find their way and let them know that there's a difference in height there when there's a step or an elevated sidewalk, for example, so they don't just trip over. Also, don't those castles and buildings on Main Street look larger than life? In fact, they're not as big as they seem. The Disney Imagineers used a trick called forced perspective to make things look